Social media thrives on outrage and spectacle.
And when stories of high control Catholicism get pulled into that cycle, they can lose their depth and even cause harm.
Because these aren't just headlines or content, they're people's lives. How do we share sensitive stories without turning them into clickbait?
Join us as we ask how to tell these stories responsibly in a world that rewards virality without losing their depth or their dignity. Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
the show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed,
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
and embrace a fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
No topic is off limits, and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go!
This episode is about something we haven't really touched on before. How we tell stories of high control Catholicism without causing harm.
Exactly. We're not offering rigid rules here, but rather some invitations for how to approach these stories responsibly.
Because in a social media world, the line between advocacy and exploitation can sometimes get blurry. Viral content and influencer culture tend to reward attention, not nuance.
Which means sensitive stories can get reduced to sound bites or clickbait instead of fostering understanding.
So today we're asking, how do we share these stories with care?
We'll talk about accessibility, platforming, transparency, and power, why they matter, and how they shape ethical advocacy.
Let's get into it.
From our experiences working on the High Control Catholicism series, we really wanted to step back and reflect on what we've learned about telling these stories responsibly. More important than ever, especially as we see people engage in stories about high control Catholicism, is understanding and offering guidelines and invitations for people to think critically and understand our reasoning behind why we share the stories that we do and in the ways that we do. In today's social media world, the line between ethical storytelling and exploitation is often blurred. Influencer culture and vital content rewards visibility and engagement rather than nuance or developing empathy with the people in our stories and the people telling them, which can unintentionally privilege certain voices while flattening the diversity of experiences in high-control Catholic communities. Often well-meaning advocates risk further turning sensitive stories into shareable clicks rather than fostering understanding and diving deeper into power dynamics that they themselves may be perpetuating, making it critical to center transparency, intentional platforming, and survivor stories. This is an exploration of how Max and I engage ethically in responsible stewardship of people's stories and investigation.
Absolutely. And another element too in kind of trying to maybe balance all this and keep all of this in mind is also thinking about the people that are hearing the stories, people who have had their own experiences. And so what we're kind of talking about, it goes beyond the concept of a content warning or a content statement. And because it's not just about letting people know about what is coming, but also like being very intentional and relying on expertise in how to talk about what happened. It's not just polling random people about a hot topic or a sensitive, traumatic topic. It's seeking out the experts, building intentional community with people who have been through something. And, as people who have been through instances of high control Catholicism, we have a network, we know people. And so a little bit of it is that community building, which is not just good for learning and for the education and to help frame and contextualize and make sure that the way we talk about these things is actually helpful and not harmful. Not only is it really good for the community building so that we are creating healthy and healing environments rather than harmful ones. But it's also important because a lot of information and history and academic thought has been done on a lot of these topics that hasn't been translated into something that is accessible. So the accessibility piece is the other piece I wanted to highlight real quick. I know we'll talk about it, at length, but just right out the gate, I think it's really important because there is really good research on a lot of these issues, and sometimes it's not directly on the specific Catholic group that you yourself were in, but it may be observing patterns that are similar from other areas or other faith traditions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And before we get started, our first discussion will be about why storytelling ethics matter. To start this out, it's important to start with what we begin most of our episodes with, which is a content statement. Often, I think there's an impulse of content statements to be perfunctory or obligatory for people to engage with. But in many opportunities, content statements are an opportunity to preface and provide information for people to select into conversations with informed consent about harm and trauma. Many of us, many content creators, many people who are involved in this research and produce podcasts aren't sure and can't know necessarily what is going to trigger a person or what may cause them to relive or re-traumatize themselves. With that being said, it's incredibly important to start content statements not with an immediate rush into what content includes, but with meaningfully engaging with and showing intention and support of the audience itself. So taking a beat, taking a breath, orienting ourselves, orienting our audience, and allowing us to center what we want and who we are in this very moment. Because sometimes a content statement isn't going to deter someone from listening entirely. It's just going to allow them to choose into these experiences when they're in the right headspace. So content statements are an invitation for people to become more involved in the dialogue and also to provide their informed consent before they get part of these discussions. With that being said, also being specific. Content statements can't just be about disturbing or potentially damaging or harmful topics. They have to provide nuance and delicate understanding about, are we talking about suicide and self-harm? Are we talking about grief and loss? Are we talking about purity culture and clergy sex abuse? Each of these have very specific histories and experiences that someone in the audience may have connections with. So knowing and providing that intention in creating these statements is critical before we even start. In the same way that we think about land acknowledgement statements, especially on behalf of museums and other cultural centers, is thinking about that these can't just be something that we say. There has to be tangible action and intention behind the things that we put into words.
100%. And I also think that another reason why this is important, not to just to add on to what you said
No,
there,
totally.
I think it's also important because, especially with something like high control Catholicism or talking about experiences or areas of people's lives where there's been a high level of control, there tends to be an encouragement of individual people not really having boundaries. And so what that means or what that meant for their life is that's kind of often where the harm comes in. If we don't have good boundaries between, like, okay, you know, I want to go to church, I want to be a Catholic, but when it starts to invade every single aspect of my life and every single decision that I make, I no longer have that, like, free will. I no longer have those boundaries. When I have to look at a priest as a final authority and never question anything that he does, that's really problematic for, like, so many reasons. But, like, specifically from this angle, I'm thinking of boundaries. Because, and how this ties into content statements is, I don't think we should be like deep sea divers who are just like jumping off the deep end like immediately. Like, we're just going to jump in, we're going to relive everything, we're going to go as deep as possible. Like, I don't think that's a healthy or sustainable way to approach these topics. So essentially, in many ways, in my view, a content statement is part of what helps create a structure and a framework for an appropriately boundaried way of approaching a heavy topic.
Absolutely. I think that's so critical. And it also ties into something that we'll touch on a little bit later, but I want to foreground here, is that for anyone who's creating content online, they may not be the experts in these subjects. Max and I are very transparent that we are not therapists. We are not necessarily academics with specialties in specific areas that we research. We're people that have deep fascinations and deep investment in understanding high control Catholicism as people who lived through it. But as a result of that, we have to honor and privilege the labor of people that have done this work before us. That doesn't mean that we don't challenge them. Often there are systems of power and privilege that enabled people to conduct this research, often that focuses on white, cis, straight experiences within Catholicism and Christianity writ large. But it doesn't mean that those experiences and that labor should go unnoticed, nor should the possibility that people like us and people from other marginalized communities weren't able to undertake this research until now. With that being said, it's just acknowledging the people who come before us and acknowledging what skill sets we do and do not have. So for us, content statements are a way to legitimize that many of the harm that people experience from high control Catholicism is real. And sometimes just saying that things are real and that we also lived through this is important, because a lot of high control Catholicism survives on gaslighting people within the community that what they experience isn't a form of harm. With that being said, what we do as not therapists, as people who don't have specialty in psychology and psychiatry, is platforming what we know about being ethical content creators. And just as you said, Max, allowing people to maintain their boundaries. And it's not just about sharing this information for people that are in the same place that we are. It's about modeling what it means to be ethical consumers of this knowledge ourselves.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's really important too. And I mean, that's something that I know I can say I've learned a lot about in the time that we've been doing this work, which is another component that I wanted to say is like, it's not a single destination. It's not like at one point you are now an expert on how to share traumatic stories, I guess. Like, and I don't think that that's necessarily, should be a goal at all. Like you should not be thinking, yes, and then once I have enough experience, then I'll be the one to go to for this. It's like, I mean, it's important and it's good to learn these things and to share, but it is also important to realize that no one person is ever gonna have all the answers of like how best to do this type of stuff. Like, and that's the point, is that what we're saying is that it's grounded in observations from a community. It's a community of people coming together and agreeing on, actually, yes, we do have guidelines for how we engage with these difficult topics, because together we can build a stronger safety net, basically, than if we elevate one person too highly and expect that person to know everything. Because honestly, at that point, and I'm sure you would recognize this too, Emma, we are then just perpetuating or becoming similar to the systems that we are trying to critique.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one thing that you said that's really important is that this is about a journey through a process, both of research and also investigating for ourselves. So before we, and actually in starting delving into this conversation, we note that this is one aspect of our perspectives, the power and the privilege that we experienced as white queer people directly impacts the guidelines and invitations that we offer to you all. With that being said, there are many other approaches that are ethical and sound in how they invite people to engage with and create this content. But Max, I specifically want to highlight, as you said, that this is a journey. It's not necessarily a destination. So both you and I will continue to learn and hopefully be challenged, challenging each other, challenging ourselves, having our audience challenge us so that we can become more literate in this process. But as a result of that, it's incredibly important when we're thinking about ethical storytelling to realize that the stories that we share, the research that we share, the lived experiences, they travel fast. and they can often get distorted. I think social media platforms amplify voices, but they also reward people who can get the most clicks, the most content, the most views. Personal testimonies and sensitive histories can quickly become content designed to grab attention. I know many of us have seen really traumatic videos spread like wildfire online, where it's often the person who's sharing it getting monetized rewards from sharing deeply traumatic moments, rather than stopping to educate and foster understanding. And I think it often perpetuates a belief that just documenting a moment is enough, or just
Mm,
sharing content is enough and engaging and deconstructing it, when there's a whole nother section that needs to be involved.
mm.
We need to unpack what influencer culture shapes about how our stories are told.
Yeah, the influencer culture element is, I think, important because um, influencers do play a very important role in spreading visibility. And I know that, like, in the ex-evangelical world, in the ex-Mormon world, we've touched on this a lot, but like part of what helped spread those messages were particular voices who were speaking up. So it's very important, but it often can be complicated if there isn't a community at the end of it that's independent of whatever influencer. Like, if a specific person creates a space, then that space is going to be affected by who that person is, what their identity is, what they see as important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, can become the same problem of another little controlling type of space where it's like, because it's that person's idea, that person's particular vision, instead of what I think ideally would happen in the Catholic space or even the ex-Catholic space, however this space gets developed, is that you have like a emphasis on coalition building. So like multiple people are in dialogue publicly about important issues within Catholicism, and then those people are not all from the same identity group. That's the that's the other issue that Catholics sometimes struggle with, and I think a lot of that is because it's a very hierarchical church, and we're used to always looking up to the next level of authority, and everyone in those positions of authority are men, and fairly often white men, and fairly often cisgender men. Like, I mean, almost always. Sometimes, if it is this influencer based existence, it can become a platform that was meant to share stories and educate people, but again, can inadvertently create hierarchies of whose experiences are considered more valid just because of who's getting the most amplification or the most noise. And additionally, within systems or structures like that, the line between advocacy and exploitation can become threadbare. It can become so easy to exploit trauma or kind of mine their audience for people who have experienced something. It's really important to make sure that, you know, an individual person's lived experience doesn't become reduced to just a clip, a headline, a clickbait moment designed for engagement metrics rather than like the reflection and care that those people deserve. Because, you know, in our work, I would say, Emma, like many times it's people who share lived experiences not to share them. It's this work resonated with me and I want to tell you about it, but it's not for consumption. And so part of it too is making sure there is space for that, making sure there's space to acknowledge people and provide the validation of, yes, like we are engaged in this work and we do see you, and we're not here to try to pressure you or get you in front of a camera to say whatever it is that we think would be the most viral clip. Like, I'm not here to like get you to cry on camera, because seeing you crying will, people will want to be, oh, what are they crying about? That's not at all the direction.
Absolutely. And I want to build, Max, on something that you said about the idea that I think among social media influencers, among people who create content online, there's an idea that there is ownership over these
Right.
individuals' stories, and not only over individuals' lived experiences and how they're monetized and marketed, but also ownership over topics. Each of us brings a different perspective, and we are not the authorities on high control religion. Max and I will say
100%.
that readily. Um,
Yes.
we are excited to engage with it and have found many generative relationships and have connected with really impactful communities that are for the first time hearing the language of their experiences expressed. But from our perspective, ownership is something that can only be tied to specific communities that are deconstructing and processing. That's why all these ethical guidelines and our own understanding and philosophy behind sharing content has to be rooted in our community connections. It has to be rooted in our own understanding and relationships with people that consent to sharing their own stories and that consent to sharing stories that inform the research that we do. So I think, just as you say, Max, audiences are hungry for content, but what we can do ethically is provide the context that people need. Ethical storytelling ensures that content is not only informative and supportive, but also protective of those whose stories are being shared. It's this that shapes the future of advocacy. How are we modeling storytelling to influence what people expect from advocacy moving forward? By centering ethics, transparency, and survivor voices, we create a blueprint for sustainable, responsible advocacy that doesn't replicate the power dynamics of the communities that we're critiquing, but rather asks the communities that we're critiquing and the communities that have deconstructed to engage with us sustainably and authentically on what it means to unpack these power systems.
100%. And you touched on it in there, which I think the goal, one of the major goals is more so to spread the shared language, to teach people who may have experienced something but may not have, the language of how we are going to talk about this, because that is kind of the foundation of any dialogue that can happen about it, but also the education moving forward about what even happened. So contrasting building up shared language with the idea of, oh, this is a sensationalized story that I want to get attention for. If we do shared language, then we are again inviting people to participate and creating a space where growth and movement can happen. Um, Another element that we want to touch on in this episode here is grounding in lived experience. So, as we said, we have not experienced every possible version of high control Catholicism, and also because of our identities, we've experienced the things that we have experienced in very specific ways. Like for myself, as a transgender white person, and now as a man, like the world that I live in and operate in now is a lot different than when I was growing up. And even though I still had my whiteness, of course, but like I have even experienced a seismic shift in identity and privilege in the world just in my own life. So we just want to definitely acknowledge at this part of the conversation that we have to have transparency about those parts of our experiences. And for me specifically, coming from a very conservative background where it was all I knew and it informed how I viewed everything, I kind of had an off switch in my brain for anything that was too complicated. Like back in the day, I would always say that I just didn't really care about politics or felt apathetic towards them, which is definitely a sign of privilege. But again, it was also my way of not engaging with something that I knew would cause problems for the way that I was interacting with and viewing the world. And then also within my background, I was very involved in conservative Catholic video production. And something I observed a lot within that world was wanting people to say something specific on video for a very specific testimonial. So that's another reason why I personally feel particularly sensitive about how we engage with these stories, is because I've seen firsthand what happens when you don't respect a person's individual voice and instead are putting all this pressure on them behind the camera, like, can you do it again, but more of like this, or like, can you touch on this, or like, can you do it this way? And I even was involved. I worked on a project where I met somebody, and then she told me later she was interviewed. She was a Catholic musician, and she was interviewed later by a bigger group than what the little project I was working on. And in that experience, she broke down at one point and was telling about them something very sensitive And she specifically told them at the time, please don't use this. And they actually went ahead and used it anyway. So this is just why I'm saying, like, for me personally, I've seen the unethical practices firsthand. And that's another reason why it's just like really important to me now that not to treat people that way, to make sure that obviously the consent thing is like should be base level, but just to really make sure that people are comfortable and not pushing themselves to have to share like these really painful things, but sharing the things that feel appropriate to share, that feel that they can generate and that are healthy and generative for everybody involved, the listeners and the person sharing.
Absolutely. And I know my background is a little bit different in terms of the work that I do. So also, as you say, Max, as someone who is cisgender and white, that affords me a great deal of privilege, not only within just wider American communities, but also within the LGBTQ plus community. And something that we see right now is a lack of solidarity with trans, queer, and non-binary people among gay and lesbian individuals that feel they have been afforded a level of rights to where they don't need to advocate for the very trans people that fought for their will and opportunity and just rights to exist, who are at the forefront of the LGBTQ plus liberation movement. With that being said, my background is similar in that I work in a field of documentation and history and storytelling, but the field I work in is oral history. So for me, oral history really privileges allowing people and holding space for people to tell their own stories in their own voices. So oral history is grounded on the idea that many people have not had the opportunity to share their stories in written formats because of systems of marginalization. Whether that means they didn't have a chance to learn to read and write, whether that means that their records were destroyed both as protective and preservative measures, but also as a form of violence, especially common in queer and trans histories right now. A lot of the work that I love doing in oral history and that I find meaningful is not only focusing on informed consent, but also holding space for people not only to tell their stories in their voices, but to exert their own power and authority over how their stories are shared and used. So within the Queer and Catholic Oral History Project, that means that there is ongoing discussion among people who contribute about what details are included, what information about people's location, their family members, what names are used, what pronouns are used, and a conceptualization that even though this is capturing a specific history at a specific moment of time, the ways in which we identify and we create our communities change and vary from time to time. So even though we're capturing a specific moment in which this conversation happened, it doesn't mean that we're not going to change a person's name to share what they identify with. It doesn't mean that we're not going to update pronouns. It doesn't mean that we're not going to allow them to modify which details are included for their safety and protection. It means that, and this is something that Max and I will touch on later, that when we're engaging with survivor stories, when we're engaging with people that have experienced high control Catholicism, that it can't be a one-off experience. It can't be a one-off collection of traumas, a one-off collection of histories within religious exploitative systems. It has to be an ongoing conversation and a reciprocal relationship between people that are receiving something from us and gaining something from the work that we do, but also feel that what they're doing is received, appreciated, acknowledged, and also is actively equal and representative of what they offer as part of this project. It's the reason that Max and I very much leverage and share lived experience pieces of people sharing their stories at the same time that we share our deep dives, because both are on equal footing for sharing things. We've heard from people that read this story that were deeply impacted about learning about a system, including purity culture and covenant communities that they hadn't learned of before, but also people that for the first time, because someone had the strength and vulnerability to share their lived experience, for the first time see themselves reflected and can begin that process. Both are equal and incredibly important. So acknowledging that, leveraging a person's lived experience, but also making sure that beyond informed consent, we're engaging in an ongoing reciprocal and authentic process is critical.
100%. And I think something that your discussion about oral history and the importance there pulls out and highlights is, again, not assuming a default. So the default assumption is, well, everybody can read and write. Like everybody has a phone. Everybody can do XYZ. And it's like, well, actually no. And let's like break down and talk about it. Like let's look at what is or is not available or accessible. Like let's talk about our ideas about who is default. Like we need to be actively engaging in them, not just standing on them as if, not standing on the authority of our perceived importance because of our proximity to a default. um that was my little that was my little soapbox there.
I love it. I love it. And I think we're going to get on a lot of soapboxes today. And that is incredibly important, especially right now with everything going on.
Yes.
And I think what you say, Max, is a wonderful transition into our discussion about accessibility and audience care. So for us, one thing that we intentionally did in starting this specific series, it was kind of built in our former masculinity series of sharing and investigating content in a podcast format and then investigating in essays. Because we noticed that some people really love deep dives. Some people like us, and it makes my heart sing every single time when I hear that somebody opened every single link in the document and is going to read them. But some people enjoy engaging and learning through audio, through video, through different content, through screen reader use, voiceovers. So creating and sharing content that includes the same information in different language in different ways, but also in different formats is incredibly important because we don't know the way in which a person is going to want to engage because there's no default. Everyone has different learning styles. And this is a key part about content statements. We not only share it in our podcast episodes, but also in our written pieces because everyone should have the opportunity to select into these experiences.
Yes. And I think it's also, this is a good moment to highlight, it is something we learned as we went because, for example, when we first started, we did have the podcasting kind of always kind of there. And another thing is, like, for our essays on Substack, one thing I do like about using the Substack platform is that they do have a reader voice available. At this moment, we don't have the bandwidth to record all of our essays, so it's nice that there is a reader available both in the app, and they have now added it to the website. So that's really important. But what I was going to say is, us learning as we go, we realized that we don't always so often it'll be, we'll do a podcast that'll be connected to our main topic, but maybe it's not going to be the exact same. It won't be exactly on the same topic. Like, I don't know, if a good example, maybe like we talked to Teresa Thompson about religious trauma, but at the same time we were maybe writing about masculinity. So the themes were connected, but not exactly the same. And what we learned was that we could offer a recap essay. And in that essay, instead of just being limited to the show notes of an episode where you could write an essay in there, but I don't know if people would appreciate that because they're just looking to know what the episode is about. So then we started to do these recap essays, and Emma and I both found these very generative, not only because we have frequently had people who don't listen, but who do read the essay. So those people were previously like feeling like they were missing out from these other topics we were exploring from different angles with guests. And now they have the option. These recap essays give Emma and I an opportunity to go deeper on some of the things that came up that were especially generative from the episode. So I think I'm feeling like I want to highlight that particularly because not only does it demonstrate how we learn as we go, but also it shows how, like, again, we're not trying to reach a singular destination. And that's kind of another thing with like this idea of an expose. It's not really about an expose. It's not like we have pulled back the curtain on everything there is to know.
Scooby-Doo mask. It was Christian nationalism all along.
Dun dun dun. But rather we are working towards building better frameworks and accessible ways of accessing information for the future of humanity, really. That sounds extreme, but I feel like that's what it is. It's like we want to help the human project as a whole. We're not trying to just create one viral moment.
Absolutely. And more than anything, it's because we hope that a lot of the content that we create, not only in the masculinity series, but in the high control series, is evergreen. So a lot of content, I think, online is responding to a critical breaking news moment. And that's important. People need to stay updated and aware of what's going on in the world. But at the same time, what we create in the lived experiences that we share, in the research that we do, is wanting this to live on for people that are connecting. And Max and I have seen that people now, months later after the masculinity series was released, are finding this information and finding it useful and informative. These essays are also great spaces for us to show our work. As, as a historian, I love nothing more than citing my sources. So I really appreciate that these essays give us a chance in the podcast episode where I can't be like footnote number 15, even though I'd love. But making sure that people can actually see the sources that we've used, see what we're pulling from, what we're quoting, what information, and what research and labor has been done on these topics previously, so that to understand how we got to the conclusions that we did. And also, we're doing this so that people can trace and redo our work for the sole purpose of maybe say that you came to a different conclusion. It's not saying that your view is necessarily harmful or wrong, but we're inviting you to go on your own research journey. Here's some informative historians, academics, scholars, also survivors of these communities that share what they lived through and also what they found as part of their quantitative and qualitative research. Listen and learn with them. Find and challenge us. Engage us in this conversation, because if it's evergreen, it means that all of these things are going to continue to evolve and shift, and essays are going to continue to grow. So it'll be, we hope, a jumping off point for many people in the future to learn how all of these things piece together, but also what they can understand and expect when going on this journey. And also, in full transparency, knowing where we got our information, what specific elements of importance and privilege go into the information that was generated, and also understanding critical to our argument, and this is my soapbox, Max, and I apologize, is that what we talk about, the institutions, the people, the networks of power, none of these are necessarily neutral. So even though we're specifically referencing news sources, we're referencing academics, we're referencing journal articles, exhibitions, specific investigative journalism pieces, documentaries, all of these pieces have a slant because they were created by human people. So understanding that nothing can truly be neutral, but that's okay. We're giving you the information that you need to come to your own conclusions based on what we share by showing our work. And also that being knowledgeable and aware and understanding our own privilege is understanding that we ourselves can never be neutral. We're not trying to give you a neutral view of what high control Catholicism is, because it doesn't exist. It's informed by our own perspectives and what we lived through.
Having all of the information, I think is the most ethical path, because then it's like, we are not telling you what to think. We are explaining how we came to think that the way that we do. So it's like, yeah, it's the difference between an authoritative voice telling you must, follow exactly how I do it or how I think about it, as opposed to, hey, here's the details. You may come to different conclusions. Some people may encounter these topics briefly and be okay with some elements of them, but not okay with all of them and need to step away and not return to it. And that's totally valid too. Like, again, we're not trying to create this top-down approach where we present ourselves as though we have more authority than we do. We want it to be a generative, healthy. I feel like I'm probably repeating myself, but it's probably a good thing to repeat about because it's important. And I think this also ties into the reciprocal relational element of this work. Means that it means thinking critically about how and who is platformed outside of the conversation of survivor stories. So this is more the coalition building that I was talking about, which is essential. It is essential that we join forces with others who are involved either in this work directly or in similar work. And that's where making sure we're finding the people who do have expertise in certain things is important. But also, and this is extremely critical, it means that we need to think about who, like what other connections and what other people have the people that we are engaged with, who have they been platforming? Because we need to make sure that in sharing good work that presents something, that we don't present a false concept of objectivity, and in that false objectivity feel empowered to platform views that are oppositional or even harmful just because we are presenting ourselves as objective, because that's not how it works. Like, there, as Emma just said, the bias is going to be there no matter what, and it's much more honest and ethical to forward that perspective and to ensure that you are not joining forces by lending them your name or by lending an endorsement to somebody who is actively doing harm through the viewpoints that they are perpetuating or sharing.
Absolutely, Max. That is so incredibly important. And as we shared in one of our most recent pieces, it's also that sometimes we engage with and platform creators that are harmful without knowing it. And even if this harm was done unknowingly, it still exists and it's still impactful. So as you learn and deconstruct and understand the harm that you cause, it's important to apologize. Even if it happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, if it happened months ago, taking that time and understanding that the harm existed is important to recognize. It's important to say an apology at any time as part of the process. It's an incredibly important moment of also taking ownership of the harm that you have caused and also making intentional reparations to the community. For further deep dives into the politics of apology, we really recommend our episode with Kaya Oakes. She provided some wonderful information on this topic. I also, Max, I'm so sorry, it's my soapbox-a-thon. I also want to say what you said is important, is that we invite you all to challenge us and question. So if the only thing that came out of a person engaging with our series is that they feel they have more ability to question the reality and the practices that they engage with, to question the systems of religion and control that they live and express, that will have been successful, because sometimes
100%.
That's the first part of the project. But I do want to be intentional that Max and I have been very clear in the podcast and in our essays that this does not equate with allowing people to question, to deny certain human truths or human dignity. Exactly. So for us, there have been several moments on podcast episodes with guests, some podcast episodes that never see the light of day, that include moments where Max and I have put our foot on the soapbox, have actually drawn our line in the sand to say, we appreciate that and we will question these things and challenge our perceptions day in and day out. But at the same time, trans and non-binary people exist. That's a truth. It's not a controversial two-sided topic. That's just what happens. Yeah. That's just the people, like we exist. We're not going anywhere. We're not disappearing. And also fundamentally denying our existence and human dignity is a vehicle of violence that has been used against us historically. So being very mindful and careful that while we are inviting you all to question us, we invite you to challenge us openly, as we've seen sometimes on our Substack and on our social media. We are here we are here to intentionally, as Teresa Thompson told us earlier, not perpetuate levels of harm, because we want this to be a safe space for people to come in and engage intentionally with their own histories. So even as we've seen some people come to these platforms and make comments, engage with us, the only times where we've really deleted or removed comments specifically come in full transparency from us in situations where we feel another person coming to this content could be harmed or traumatized by that information. Mm-hmm. And that's because they deny our human dignity. That's because they perpetuate levels of exploitation and abuse. And it's often very much in a positive format, that they themselves are engaging and coming to understand it. But this has to be a safe space that privileges our existence and in our existence and our community's well-being long term.
Absolutely. And, in those cases too, I would say, I think sometimes it's important to understand the appropriate channel, because it may not always be appropriate for someone to just come kind of guns blazing into the comments box for all those reasons that you just said. We want to make sure that for people who are vulnerable, in vulnerable situations, I can think of a million just off of the top of my head that would apply here. So pretty much anything that you can think, anybody who's in a vulnerable position, they're not, another trans person such as myself is not going to want to read things that are dehumanizing or denying of trans identity, as somebody is thinking out loud in a comment box. So what I'm just saying is there may be times where it's more appropriate to send a private message, and we read our private messages and in many cases respond. If you're respectful to us and are asking to engage in dialogue, we will likely respond and engage with that. So yeah, I think this is another huge example where boundaries are important. And, oftentimes in conservative right wing talking points, I heard this one many, many times growing up. It's like, well, they're trying to control the public square. They're trying to control what we're allowed to say. And it's like, well, we're not wanting to we're not saying that you can't think these things or hold these views. We're simply saying there are boundaries for your engagement in these public spaces, in community, with other people, because what we're not going to allow essentially is dehumanization of people. We're going to make sure that all people are allowed to have their dignity. Essentially, we're going to respect everyone's dignity as we engage in conversation, and we're not going to allow the public voicing of things that are harmful to human dignity. So as you say, Emma, that's the line in the sand. Like, if you are respectful of human dignity, you will find a place in our comment section to voice your opinion. That's how it'll be.
Absolutely. And it also means that because in part of our ethical storytelling, we are going to engage in a conversation. This is a reciprocal relationship, which means if you come into this space with views, even if they acknowledge our human dignity, that are harmful or perpetuate the same power networks, we'll challenge you. And that's because both of us, myself as a cis woman, you, Max, as a trans man, have existed and marginalized in outsider spaces within Catholic dialogue for so many years. So often when we think of LGBTQ plus Catholic spaces, the first voices and the first people that come to mind within influencer squares are white, cis, gay men. Their stories are valuable and incredibly important, but we need to think about how we're engaging with diversity. We're engaging in platforming voices that, like ours, were very much, for a great number of times, not acknowledged, celebrated, or recognized within these spaces. So when people comment and engage online, we're also going to hold them accountable to the same things that we do for ourselves, of how are we platforming and engaging with things that represent our own lived experience. And also, how are we focusing on the people that have the expertise and have the lived experience and validating that expertise and those experiences ourselves? So for us, I know Max and I have been very intentional, and I shared this at the beginning, that we are not therapists. So people in the comments that come in with specific guidance that can be helpful, again, they're speaking from their personal experience, and that's useful. But Max and I can only offer resources, crisis and long-term, and connecting people and platforming others, including Teresa Thompson in our episode, who have the expertise and wisdom to do this work, to engage with harm reduction, to engage with religious trauma in positive and ethical and in scientifically backed methods.
It's important to again not just copy a right-wing strategy. So when we look out into the world, especially for our current literal moment, we are seeing the way that like conservative money funded a very powerful right-wing machine that created the pipelines that we see with the Manoverse. And And when we talk about issues like this, I think it's really important to remind people, like with the manosphere and the pipeline, this isn't like something that Emma and I made up. This is something that has tangible academic research associated with it. This is many people who have observed that you could start watching a seemingly innocuous YouTube video about some topic, like, I don't know, maybe fitness, for example. And within a few related videos, YouTube is showing pretty extreme, hateful content, discriminatory content. So that's something that has literally been studied and documented by multiple people. So when we talk about things like that, we have these references, and that's built into this work to make sure that it stands up to scrutiny. We have the context here. And it also helps us to differentiate from echo chambers where it's just people saying different things. Like one thing we heard a lot throughout, I think throughout the first time that Trump was campaigning, is this idea of fake news, and he says fake news enough times, and he says the mainstream media is lying to you enough times without any actual evidence of that stuff, that it builds this echo chamber where everybody's saying that, but it's not actually a real thing. So that's why I'm wanting to be intentional and say, when we talk about different things like the alt-right pipeline within the manoverse, the manosphere, it is documented, and there are people who have talked about it. So, but seeing that occur in society, where people with money and power have reshaped the political sphere where everybody has to exist in a pretty detrimental way, one might be tempted to say, okay, well, what are they doing that's working? Or even further, or another example of this is like a minutia. So I'm not meaning just a big picture of how did they come into power, but also what are the literal things that they do. Okay, they're on this media platform, we need to be there. They're doing this, we need to be there. It reminds me a little bit of this concept of the new evangelization, which I often heard about, again, because of working in media, as like we just have to physically be wherever they are and challenge them in all those ways. And it kind of also adds to this idea of like, well, we have to have a Catholic version of everything. Which that's a red flag, because that's like saying, well, oh, here's a great piece of art, but it's not good enough because it's not Catholic. So it's not like perpetuating the message that I'm wanting to perpetuate or promote. But yeah, so in looking at all of these things, like all these different strategies and all these different ways that power has moved, that topics have been discussed, it's important to challenge the concept of virality in and of itself. Like, just because something is viral, just because something is a strategy that right-wing conservative people used, doesn't mean that it would be ethical to copy it. Like, we kind of are in the situation we are in because of those strategies. So a better way forward is to look at better examples of grassroots organization, to look at the history. Okay, when people fought powerful institutions or systems of power in the past that were threatening and denying human rights, what did they do? What does solidarity look like cross generationally? It's quite common for the LGBTQ community to actually, sadly, not have enough intergenerational dialogue and connection, but we can learn so much from people who have lived through some pretty critically difficult things. So yeah, I just think it's really important to make sure that we are not, taking from the playbook, taking from a harmful playbook as we approach our pathway forward.
Absolutely. I think that's incredibly important. And also not replicating it as a way to gain support or credibility on our specific networks. Because for many of us, these leverage systems of exploitation and manipulation that we don't want to follow, that are not going to lead to the success or the well-being or visibility of our own communities in ways that are intentional and authentic. I think, just as you say, this is a critical piece of how this is part of coalition building and solidarity work. The ways in which we engage with ethical storytelling have to be deeply rooted in preserving and uplifting the well-being of our communities. And that means that, just as we said at the beginning, content statements about the harms that we are going to discuss can't just be words alone. They have to directly reflect actions that we take within our own communities to highlight systems of harm, call them out, but also platform people that are part of engaging with and calling out this harm and are part of repairing it within their communities and addressing systemic issues related to homelessness, related to harm, suicide, self-harm. Along with that, thinking about food insecurity, thinking about lack of resources and access to community funding that are deeply connected to systems that exploit and manipulate us. So we have to be involved not only in engaging with this research, but also engaging with making our communities better spaces. So for us, Max and I see those things as deeply, deeply intertwined. So for us, as we see, ethical storytelling has to be rooted on central tenets of transparency, intentional platforming, engagement, and citing our sources. It has to involve not only thinking about how we create content statements, but how we put those content statements and our commitment to reciprocal, authentic relationships into action within our communities. How we're not only engaging in a transaction style relationship, how we're not falling into those influencer style engagement platforms where we monetize and leverage a person's traumatic experience for our personal gain or for virality online, but also about how the ways in which we tell stories should not only be directed and engaging with communities instead of one-off people, but also should be community and individual directed. They should be part of the process and should be leveraged as experts on their own lived experience in the same way that we leverage and are excited to share deep dives and in-depth research. With that being said, we encourage listeners to engage critically, dig into sources, challenge us, challenge yourselves on the ways in which you come to understand systems of power, systems of knowledge, religious institutions, and think about your own practices of advocacy. How can you translate commitments that you make online, the visibility that you have in your posts on social media, into actions that sustain and support the communities that we're part of? This work is hard, but it's also deeply meaningful, and it can be done ethically. It's not something that is completely separate. If we are going to do storytelling and going to engage, just as Max and I have said, in stories of high control religion, in stories of toxic masculinity, we have to not only posit a pathway forward and create and sustain and hold a hope for the future, but also investigate systems of harm and posit a way forward in ways that are ethical and are accountable to our own experiences and the own communities that allowed us to deconstruct to begin with.
I was also thinking as you were just rapping there about how basically also knowing when to take a step back, because the truth is that we do live in a system. We do live in a system that will probably prioritize a transactional approach because capitalism, we have to have money to survive, et cetera, et cetera. So I just really think it's important to also say, like, you know, if you're in that position, don't take the path of exploiting other people and other people's stories to create that. Take a step back from the work and find other ways, because I think ultimately it does more harm to approach it that way. If there is a dollar sign at the end, I can speak for myself and say that I don't do this work with the intention of making money. I do this work because it's important to me and I want to share, and also because I find great benefit in giving voice to things that are harmful or that harmed me, especially in a scary time for members of my community as a transgender person. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Like, we don't act like, you know, we have to do this work or it's the only way forward. Make sure that you know when you need to take a step back and focus on survival, because we are trying to live through very difficult times.
Max, I think that is so critical. And I'm glad that you said that. We have to be gentle with ourselves. Living right now is very much a case of survival for many of us, especially with state-sanctioned violence against queer and trans people, especially queer and trans people of color and immigrant communities. So thinking about, for many of us right now, engaging in these topics and engaging in these histories is really, really difficult when we see a rollback of our rights in literal action and in literal succession to one another. With that being said, being gentle with ourselves and also understanding that the labor and emotional investment that we do is significant, and we have to acknowledge it as such. The ways in which we challenge you all with all of our podcast episodes, with all of our essays, they are emotionally taxing. These aren't things that we take lightly, nor do we expect them for you all to take lightly or to engage with them briefly or just spontaneously. We hope that you engage with these things as we release content, but also come back to them when you have time and space to talk about it. We don't expect that everyone is involved in all of these topics at all times, because you've got to take care of yourself and your community. And self-care is community care at this moment. So taking time and taking space to prioritize your well-being, and maybe taking a step away from our content or coming back at a later time, or deciding and selecting in and out of what content is best and most approachable for you right now based on those content statements is critical for you to maintain your boundaries and to stay safe and healthy. We thank you all for going on this journey. Max and I could not have gone through our 2 series so far, our masculinity series, our high control series, without the possibility of people being invested in and sharing their lived experiences. We don't take it lightly when you all open up to us about your experiences. And just as we shared earlier, we want to privilege and prioritize your protection and your safety. So please know that we would never share anything without your permission, as we've seen some content creators do, but also that we are eager to be a safe space on this platform for people to continue to engage. So it doesn't mean that you have to have a solution or an idea or completely agree with us right now. But the work that we do is only made possible by people who continue to think and challenge their own perceptions and welcome the perceptions and challenges of others. So this work could not be possible without all of you who listen and engage with us. And we consider you equal experts and people speaking on these topics from your own lived experience. So know that you are equal parts of this process because you're the community that we're invested in and we're seeking the well-being of. So much of this work comes down to slowing down, asking better questions, and remembering that people's lives aren't content and aren't commercialized.
Right. And telling stories of high control Catholicism means holding them with care, not just putting them straight out into the algorithm.
Absolutely. Our hope is that these guidelines feel less like rigid rules and more like reminders, more like invitations that advocacy and ethical storytelling have to grow hand in hand.
Thanks for joining us in thinking through these questions. If you want to keep the conversation going, you can find us on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Like I said, we've got our comment box and you can always send us a message.
Absolutely. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. Your reflections, your experiences, your stories. This work could not exist without you. And we are always grateful for you engaging with us. Goodbye.